Rome, an empire that once devoured the ancient world. They crushed the mightiest armies, obliterated Gaul, turned Egypt into a province, subdued Judea, and even held back Parthia, the eternal enemy in the east. To Rome, there was no such thing as an unconquerable land. But then they stopped, not because they lacked soldiers, not because they lacked courage, but because of a land of endless fog, cold rain, and tribes that not only refused to be conquered, but simply couldn't be conquered. A land that made Rome's war machine stumble for the first time. That land was Caledonia, what we know today as Scotland. Picture the Pacific Northwest of the United States, Washington. Oregon, endless forests, relentless rain, thick fog so heavy you can't see an enemy a few feet away. Now, imagine sending an army burdened with heavy gear to march hundreds of miles through that wilderness, worn down by disease, facing enemies who appear and vanish like ghosts. That's what Rome's legions had to endure. In this video, we'll uncover not just a military failure, but a moment when the greatest empire of the ancient world was forced to face an uncomfortable truth. Even Rome had its limits. Stick around. Rome's most important defeat didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened on a map. To understand why Scotland became the great exception in Rome's history of conquest, we have to go back to the height of the empire's power. A defining moment in the entire history of the Roman Empire, a time when Rome neither knew nor wanted to know the meaning of the word stop. For Rome, war was never just about survival or defense. It was a legitimate tool to expand civilization, to assert dominance, to prove that Roman order must be imposed on a chaotic world. Every new province wasn't just a piece of land on the map, it was a spiritual victory, a patch of chaos brought into order, a demonstration that Roman reason could tame the universe itself. Look at their great campaigns. Julius Caesar crushed Gaul, turning dozens of so-called barbarian tribes into Roman citizens. Octavian, the first emperor, claimed Egypt, the richest jewel of the Mediterranean, making Alexandria a prized gem of the empire. Hispania was consolidated, and in the east, even Parthia, the old nemesis, was contained within Rome's drawn borders. Every victory proved nothing was out of reach. Rome was like a global corporation, endlessly expanding its markets, swallowing rivals whole. And perhaps most importantly, Rome had built for itself a mindset of invincibility. In their eyes, no campaign had ever truly failed. Sure, they suffered setbacks, lost battles here and there, but Rome always came back stronger. And sooner or later, their enemies bowed. That confidence, even arrogance, became the hallmark of Roman decision-making. So when they looked north, toward the misty highlands of Caledonia, they didn't see a real strategic challenge. They saw just another land soon to be folded into their empire. But that was their first mistake, a mistake born out of their very strength. Next, the easy win in Britannia that taught Rome the wrong lesson. In 43 CE, Rome turned its ambitious gaze toward the island of Britannia on the far northwestern edge of the known world. And the man behind that decision was Emperor Claudius. Claudius wasn't the most famous emperor in Rome's history, but he understood one thing: a victory in Britannia would cement his political legitimacy and secure his legacy as a conqueror. So the campaign was launched not cautiously, but with decisive force. With their battle-hardened war machine, the Roman legions quickly seized the south of the island. But the real key to success wasn't brute strength alone. Rome skillfully combined the sword with diplomacy, buying off and persuading local chieftains, turning potential enemies into allies. The results were astonishing. Within just a few decades, southern Britannia began to resemble a typical Roman province. Straight, stone-paved roads linking forts with cities, amphitheaters, forums, and public baths rising as clear symbols of Roman life. Architecture and engineering stamped into every brick and arch. But most importantly, Rome applied its most reliable formula: win and integrate. The native aristocracy was granted Roman citizenship, invited into the imperial administration, promised a place within the Roman world. This didn't just bring stability, it gave locals the sense that they weren't being conquered, but upgraded, transformed from barbarian tribes into part of the greatest civilization on Earth. With all these successes, the Romans assumed Britannia would become another success story just like Gaul or Hispania. But when they looked further north, toward the land called Caledonia, they made a fatal miscalculation, thinking it would be just as easy to repeat the formula. After conquering southern Britannia with such ease, Rome lifted its gaze northward. There lay Caledonia, a misty, mountainous land, sparsely populated. In Rome's eyes, it was nothing more than the next step in expansion. To them, Caledonia seemed insignificant. No capital city to seize, no king or court to overthrow. But that was Rome's deadly mistake. What the Romans saw as a sign of weakness, fragmentation. Lack of centralized power was in fact Caledonia's greatest strength, and one of the most underestimated enemies in the entire history of the Roman Empire. Rome excelled at defeating kingdoms with kings, capitals, and fortresses. They knew how to negotiate with elites, cut off supply lines, or burn a city to force surrender. But when the enemy had no central weakness, no ruler to negotiate with, no capital to capture, the empire's massive machine suddenly had no target. Rome looked at Caledonia and thought, just a few barbarian tribes. But that arrogance led them into a land where nature, people, and an unbreakable spirit of resistance fused together into a wall no army could ever breach. And from here, the story changed. What Rome expected to be a quick, easy campaign turned into a nightmare that dragged on for centuries. Quick gut check. How do you conquer a people with no capital? No king? No center? Rome had no playbook for that. When the legions marched north, leaving behind the wealthy south of Britannia, they had no idea what awaited them. The true enemy wasn't warriors with spears and swords, it was Caledonia itself. The highlands rose like towering natural walls, impossible to pierce with Rome's straight, paved roads. The lochs deep, dark lakes scattered across the land were like open wounds in the earth. Peat bogs silently swallowed horses, supply carts, and even men, as if they had never existed. And then came the rain, not Mediterranean rain brief, refreshing showers but endless, punishing downpours. Day after day, water hammered the soldiers, soaking armor, rotting food, rusting weapons. Fog rolled in so thick a legionary couldn't see his comrade a few steps away. Scouts lost direction. Patrols vanished and never returned. In this merciless climate, Rome's soldiers began to fall not to enemy blades, but to nature itself. Dysentery swept through the camps. Strange fevers and lung infections stole lives silently. Heavy armor corroded in the damp, supplies spoiled before they could be eaten. The Roman legion had always been a perfect war machine marching in order, building identical camps, supplied with clockwork precision. But in Caledonia, the machine broke down. No straight roads, no model forts, no reliable supply lines. Everything was against them. Rome had mastered the art of fighting men defeating armies, negotiating with kings, forcing cities to surrender. But in Caledonia, the enemy wasn't men, it was nature itself. And for the first time, even Rome felt powerless. But if nature was bad, the humans waiting in the mist were worse, and then, just when the Romans thought they were fighting only rain, fog, and swamps, human enemies emerged. But in the eyes of the legions, these were unlike any they had ever faced. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Roman writers called them Caledonians. Only later, around 297 CE, Roman sources began using the term Picti, the painted ones. So when we speak of them here, We're really talking about the Caledonian tribes later known as the Picts. They decorated their skin with deep blue patterns, mystical symbols likely made from a local plant called woad. In the mist, their painted bodies seemed half real, half phantom apparitions moving between trees. To a Roman soldier, it was impossible to tell flesh and blood, or a ghost. But the truth was even more frightening. The Picts were not a nation. They had no king, no capital, no senate. They were dozens of tribes and clans scattered through mountains, valleys, and forests. What Rome saw as backward disorganization was, in fact, their greatest weapon. Rome could topple a monarchy by killing a king, or break a city to crush resistance. But with the Picts, cutting off one head didn't kill the snake because every tribe was another head, striking back on its own. Their homes reflected that independence. Instead of grand fortresses, they built broche stone round towers perched high on ridges, commanding wide views, difficult to attack, nearly impossible to surround. And unlike Rome's other enemies, the Picts weren't tied to large-scale agriculture. They lived by hunting, fishing, and foraging. When danger came, they didn't defend farms or granaries. They simply vanished into the forest. No fields to burn, no storehouses to loot, no towns to sack. Rome's favorite weapon, hunger, was useless here. To Rome, the Picts were just scattered savages, but in reality, they were a living network, adaptable, elusive, and patient. They knew the land, they knew how to disappear, and they knew how to return when Rome least expected it. They were ghosts in the mist and for the empire. That was a nightmare you could never strike down. If the Roman legions were like moving walls of steel, then the Picts were daggers in the dark. They didn't fight the way Rome expected. They invented a different kind of war, a war of shadows. There were no grand battles to decide victory or defeat, no open stage for the legions to showcase their disciplined formations. The Picts refused to give Rome the kind of showdown it wanted. Instead, they fought asymmetrically, ambushing on narrow trails, striking at night, when Roman camps lay asleep, burning supply depots, torching outposts, cutting off food lines, turning every Roman day into a fight for survival. For a Roman soldier, war was supposed to begin with the blare of trumpets and the clash of formations. But in Caledonia, war began when they thought the road was safe and ended with arrows from the mist, spears from the underbrush, or boulders rolling down a hillside. It was a kind of warfare where they never knew where the enemy was, how many there were, or when they would appear. And the problem ran deeper. Roman soldiers carried 60-80 pounds of gear, shields, armor, swords, rations, tools. They were built for open battlefields and decisive clashes. The Picts, by contrast, were fast, light, and fluid. They melted into the woods as if they'd never been there. Strike, vanish, repeat, always on their own terms. Rome had always believed discipline, order, and collective strength were the keys to victory. But in Caledonia, those very strengths became burdens. In the cold, endless fog, the world's most powerful army became the hunted. And when the sword failed, Rome reached for its other weapon, the power of assimilation. But this time, even that broke down. For centuries, Rome didn't win by the sword alone. Their most powerful weapon was something else entirely: assimilation. Look at Gaul. After bloody wars, Celtic tribes, once fiercely independent, eventually wore togas, spoke Latin, and sent their sons to serve in the legions. In Judea and Germania, despite constant uprisings, Rome managed to lure local elites, granting them citizenship, status, even seats in the imperial machine. With a mix of carrots and sticks, Rome turned enemies into allies, warriors into officials, rebels into new Romans. This was the empire's secret formula: win and integrate, conquer, then absorb. But in Caledonia, the formula collapsed. The Picts didn't need togas. They didn't want to learn Latin. They had no use for Roman baths and no interest in Roman citizenship. They wanted only to live as they always had, hunting, fishing, foraging, and to resist anyone who entered their land with a sword. This was something Rome had never faced before, a culture that simply refused to play the game. Rome could buy off a king, but in Caledonia, there was no throne to offer. Rome could transform a city into a Roman town, but here, there were no cities to transform. For the first time, the empire discovered a hard truth. Not everyone wanted to become Roman. And against an enemy that couldn't be bribed, couldn't be assimilated, the most sophisticated political machine of the ancient world found itself powerless. When assimilation didn't work, Rome turned to the weapon it had used for centuries, the one that had forced even the proudest peoples to bow: fear. The formula was brutally simple and brutally effective. Wherever the legions marched, they burned fields, seized food, took hostages, and leveled villages. It was the harsh lesson Gaul had endured, Judea had tasted, and Germania had eventually submitted to. When bellies were empty, when homes were ash, when children were taken as collateral, even the fiercest tribes bent the knee to Rome. But in Caledonia, the formula didn't work, because what was there to destroy? The Picts had no centralized farmland to torch, no massive granaries to plunder. Their small villages could vanish into the hills within hours. When the legions arrived, they found only cold fire pits, thin smoke rising on the horizon, and nothing. No hostages to seize, no resources to confiscate, no leverage to turn into terror. And so, the empire that had always mastered its enemies through their stomachs now faced an opponent who did not hunger in the same way. For the first time, Rome's most terrifying weapon, the ability to force submission through fear, was useless, which meant the empire had just lost its last strategic card to play. If fear didn't work, maybe bricks and forts would, or so Rome thought. When fear failed and assimilation failed, Rome tried yet another strategy: control through infrastructure. They built massive forts, as if to declare the empire's roots would grow deep in this land. One of the most striking examples was Unconquerable, a colossal fortress in the heart of Caledonia, designed to house thousands of soldiers, a new hub of Roman power in the north. But archaeology tells a different story. More than 750,000 iron nails were buried or left behind before the fortress was even completed. Why? Because the legions had to abandon the site mid-construction, hiding the nails so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. And Unconquerable was no exception. Time and again, the same pattern repeated: build with grand ambitions of permanent occupation, hold briefly, hoping to project influence, then abandon, driven out by the invisible pressure of terrain and relentless Pictish raids, instead of lasting monuments. Rome left behind ruins, scattered scars across Scotland, reminders of wasted effort. The economic lesson was just as stark. Rome's supply chain was stretched to absurdity. Stone had to be hauled from distant quarries. Garrisons needed grain, wine, oil, tools, every ounce of it shipped from the south. Each extra mile north added ambush risk, extra guards, and mounting exhaustion. The cost was staggering. The return? Practically nothing. No thriving markets, no rich mineral veins, no Romanized cities generating tax revenue. These forts, imagined as symbols of Roman permanence, became tombstones of arrogance. They tell us that some lands, the harder you try to control them, the faster they drain you dry. And the forts weren't the only monuments to failure. Next came walls so massive, they defined the empire itself. After decades of bleeding men and treasure in the north, Rome finally made a turning point decision. And that decision came from Emperor Hadrian, one of the most famous rulers of the 2nd century. In the year 122 CE, Hadrian ordered the construction of a colossal barrier, a wall stretching 73 miles, from the Irish Sea in the west all the way to the North Sea in the east. But this was more than a military project. It was a political statement, a blunt admission. This is far enough. Stop here. Until then, Rome had always defined itself by expansion. Every generation pushed the map outward. Every emperor sought to extend the frontier. But Hadrian's Wall marked something entirely different. For the first time in the entire history of the Roman Empire, the mightiest empire of the ancient world drew a permanent line. The wall wasn't just stone on stone, it was reinforced with watchtowers for surveillance, gates to control movement, garrisons stationed along its length. It was no longer the spirit of a conquering machine, but of an empire contracting to defend itself. Hadrian's Wall was not merely a barrier of stone. It was a symbol of limitation. A reminder to Rome itself, even we cannot rule everything. But Rome couldn't sit still. A new emperor would push the frontier again and fail again. But Rome was Rome. An empire built on the habit of always moving forward wasn't going to accept the boundary it had just drawn. Barely 2 decades after Hadrian's Wall was finished, a new emperor rose, Antoninus Pius, and he refused to stop. Antoninus believed the north could still be tamed. He ordered the construction of another wall, pushing the frontier nearly 100 miles farther north, what we now call the Antonine Wall. But this time, Rome no longer had the resources to build something eternal out of stone. The Antonine Wall was turf pressed on a stone base far weaker, far more fragile. And sure enough, it lasted less than 20 years. Endless Pictish raids, combined with the crushing cost of keeping garrisons supplied, brought the wall down not by siege, but by exhaustion. Rome was forced to retreat, and when they did, the frontier fell back to Hadrian's Wall, the original line, now made permanent. The Antonine Wall tells a simple, bitter story. Rome still had the will to expand, but no longer the capacity to make that will real. From this point on, the greatest empire of the ancient world had entered the age of defense, but one emperor wasn't ready to play defense. His answer? Total war. A century after Hadrian's Wall, Rome still hadn't extinguished the fire in the north. The tribes still crossed the frontier, torching outposts, ambushing patrols. And so, in 208 CE, one emperor made the decision: either end Caledonia once and for all, or die trying. That emperor was Septimius Severus. Though elderly and in failing health, Severus refused to hand this task to anyone else. He personally led the campaign, bringing along his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, to witness what he hoped would be Rome's final conquest. He mobilized nearly 50,000 soldiers, one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled on British soil. For the rugged geography of Scotland, this was a staggering number, turning the north into a battlefield. And the plan was brutally simple: no building, no assimilation, no negotiation. Only one order remained: destroy, kill all who resist. Ancient historians record Severus's words: subjugate the whole land, kill all who resist. Perhaps the line was embellished, perhaps not. Either way, it perfectly captured the spirit of the campaign. Rome no longer sought to persuade, it sought to erase Caledonia from the map of resistance. This was not just another war, It was Rome's final all-in gamble, a desperate attempt to break a small but unyielding land. And yet, with all of Rome's fury unleashed, Caledonia barely blinked. In 208, 50,000 Romans marched into Caledonia convinced this would be the campaign to end it all. 3 years later, all that remained was silence. Rome burned everything in its path, villages in flames, forests cut down, crops reduced to ash. It was the same formula that had crushed Gaul, Germania, and Judea. But in Caledonia, it meant nothing. The tribes didn't depend on large farms or grain stores. They lived scattered, mobile, ready to abandon a village in hours. When Roman legions arrived, they found only cold ashes and empty land. Meanwhile, as Roman troops slogged through swamps and bogs, the tribes hid in the highland mist. And then, like ghosts, they struck back, ambushing supply convoys, raiding camps at night, attacking and vanishing, leaving only footprints or nothing at all. Rome searched desperately for a decisive battle, but that battle never came. Rain poured, wind cut, mud swallowed every step. Roman soldiers, burdened with 80 pounds of armor and gear, sank deeper with every mile. Inside the camps, disease spread fast. Dysentery drained men of strength. Pneumonia and fevers killed thousands before they ever met the enemy. Supply lines from the south broke down. Soldiers starved in their own fortifications. The army famed for iron discipline fell apart not in glorious combat, but from within. And Septimius Severus himself, the emperor who staked everything on this campaign, could not escape fate. He fell gravely ill as his army withered. In 211 CE, Severus died at Eboracum, modern York. His legions were exhausted, the campaign unfinished, and Caledonia still defiant, beyond reach. It was a defeat without glory. No treaty, no surrender, no triumphal return to Rome. A cold truth remained. After nearly 2 centuries, Rome never truly conquered Caledonia. At the far edge of Britannia, Rome learned its harshest lesson. Not every land is worth conquering, and not every people can be subdued. So what happens when the unconquerable becomes a symbol? That's where Caledonia's legend begins. The Roman Empire, the greatest war machine of the ancient world, did not stop before Gaul, did not stop before Egypt, did not stop before Judea. But at the far edge of Britannia, in the cold rain and fog, Rome was finally forced to halt. This did not happen because Rome lacked soldiers. They brought more than 50,000 men. It was not because Rome lacked courage. Their legions had faced far stronger enemies before. The true reason lay in Caledonia, a land where harsh nature itself became an ally of the people, a people who neither needed Rome nor wanted Rome, and flatly refused assimilation. Caledonia became a symbol of limits, a place where even the mightiest empire had to admit, for perhaps the only time in the entire history of the Roman Empire, we cannot rule everything. And that is the timeless lesson. Every superpower, no matter how great, eventually reaches its stopping point. Military strength, clever strategy, organizational genius, all of it can carry an empire far. But sooner or later, there will be a land, there will be a people that simply cannot be subdued. Caledonia was never a Roman province. It became a legend, a living reminder that even Rome had boundaries. And sometimes, true strength does not lie in conquering, but in refusing to be conquered. And that symbol didn't stay in the past, it echoes into our modern wars and businesses. The story of Caledonia isn't just about 2,000 years ago. It still echoes today, especially for Americans. A nation that has faced the very same dilemma Rome once did. Over the past 2 decades, the United States has been mired in what historians and journalists now call forever wars. Iraq, Afghanistan, and before that, Vietnam. The common threads? Overwhelming force. Like Rome, the US fielded the most powerful military of its time. Quick military wins. Baghdad fell in weeks. Kabul collapsed in a matter of days. But the war never ended. The enemy wasn't centralized, had no capital to capture, and didn't need to win big battles, they only needed to survive. The result? More than 8 trillion in Aus, according to Brown University's Cost of War project. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and in the end, withdrawal and chaos. Just as Rome learned in Caledonia, sheer military might cannot break a people who refuse to be absorbed. The same trap appears in business. Companies fall into their own Caledonia problem, pouring resources into a tough market where customers resist change. Building infrastructure, marketing campaigns, distribution systems, only to see profits never arrive. ROI turns negative, just like Rome's abandoned forts, grand at their start, but ending as nothing more than sunk costs. Many US giants have faced this. Walmart in Germany pulled out after 9 years, losing over $1 billion. Google in China, 2010, forced to exit after failing to bend the local culture and laws. Even Starbucks in Australia, where the chain model collapsed against entrenched local coffee culture. Sometimes, building your own Hadrian's Wall, drawing a firm boundary, and knowing which markets not to chase is the only way to keep your empire alive. In life, we often ask, can I do this? Just like Rome always asked, how much farther can we conquer? But the wiser question is, should I do this? Maybe you can take on that extra project. Open a new branch, push for the next promotion. But if the cost is your health, your family time, your peace of mind, then like Caledonia, it's a battle that will never truly pay off. True strength isn't about how far you can go. It's about knowing when to stop. Rome never learned that lesson in Caledonia. The question is, will we? Which brings us to the real question, if you were Rome, what would you do? So, if you were a Roman emperor, what would you do? Would you keep pouring in soldiers and gold to try conquering Caledonia? Or would you stop, build a wall, and accept the limit? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective, not just as history buffs, but as citizens of today's world, where our own Caledonias still exist in many forms. If this resonated, like, subscribe, and share so others can join the conversation. And finally, I'll leave you with one question to ponder. Hadrian drew a wall. Where would you draw yours?